changes. One of the things I think I wrote in my blurb was like, expression originates in the bow, which is of course nonsense. Expression originates in our imagination. And the bow is kind of a translator of this. But I want to explore some of the fundamentals of sound production, in particular reference to Capet, Lucien Capet. Some of you might know, some of you might not. So I'm hoping that that will be interesting today. But before we do, I just start with something that I love by Capet, 2 quotes by Capet, which shows his direction. Capet, of course, a 19th century violinist, was renowned for his revival or his exposition of the Beethoven string quartets. And I love his attitude that is communicated here about the position of art, the entire function that a musician has in relation to concepts like beauty and art. And that it is not a question of a sort of functionalization of our skills, but it's a question of changing us in order to be recipients of beauty. It's a very spiritual approach to bow technique that he has, actually. This is straight from a work called Technique Supérieure de l'archet, which is higher art of bowing sometimes. There's a translated version in English. And actually there's a free version in German, if you can read German. Or even if you can't read German, it's still interesting because of the exercises on the internet, on IMSLP. Yeah. Let's see, first of all though, if we talk about tone and tone production, I've used deliberately the term tone. What do we actually refer to? What do we mean? What is tone to start with? The Germans call it Tonklang. We sort of have an idea that there's a difference between tone and sound, perhaps. Sound is much more neutral. Tone seems to be more enlivened. We talk about tone, we talk about intentionality. And of course, intentionality, I've talked about this before in many other contexts. Intentionality is actually at the root of music and music making. Without intentionality, we have no expression, we have no music. We can have signals, but we don't have any music. So tone, in some ways, is the fundamental phenomenon in which intentionality or intention manifests itself. The question is, of course, always, is tone personal? So is a violinist's sound his or her sound? We talk a lot about this, your sound. In some ways it is, just like our voice is our voice, and there are some fundamental physiological things that and psychological things that communicate through our voice, through our timbre of voice. But at the same time, it can't be the whole story, because we do need to have modifiable tone. We need to be able to use tone to express whatever we believe is artistically required by a piece of music. So we can't just use our tone. That's a bit like using our sauce on every meal kind of thing. We have to have a great range of tone, and we have to understand and teach how we can modify tone. So it's not just all personal, and I would like to also sort of suggest that sometimes working on my tone makes things very subjective in a bad sense, and by that I mean is that it makes it mysterious. So when we come to hurdles in our students' playing or our own playing, we feel this is just my tone is no good, I'm no good kind of thing. So we do have a responsibility, I think, as artists and teachers, to try to transcend that and get past this subjectivism as much as we can. Although of course the subjective is a big component of art, at the same time we want to understand how we need to think, how we need to feel, how we need to imagine what we are to do to be able to develop it. So in that sense, saying tone is personal and maybe that's the entire story can be limiting to us. That's what I'm trying to suggest. Of course, tone for us is a result of imagination of tone. We often have multi-sensual conception. We say tone is thick, we say it's velvety, we have tactile sense of tone. Some people have strong color associations with tone. We might associate different tempo, different color of tone when we say yellow to brown or dark blue, etc. Depends how our imagination is structured, but we know that synesthesia, multisensorial imagination is actually quite useful to talk about tone when we want to speak to our students and to speak to other musicians about what we imagine here. Bright and dull, for example, visual metaphors, we speak about tone, because it's very difficult actually to speak about tone, because the dynamic capacity, the transient dynamic capacities or the characteristics of tone make it hard to latch on to it. So we talk about experiences here, and we talk about different senses to try to give us a sense. For us as musicians, the tone and the source and origin of tone, I think, originates in what we call the expressive ear. Some people have called the expressive ear. A Russian psychologist and musicologist, Dina Kenarskaya. She talks about this, this ability of our expressive ear to be at the source of our music making. And with our students and with ourselves, we can always identify this expressive ear when we start to sing. The singing is the drafting process, I think, for us, for tone. And if we use it a lot and we use it repetitively, we find that many things translate directly into the instrumental playing. Things like articulation, for example. In the end, we want the connection between the expressive ear, the singing brain, if you like, and the movement of the arms. So this becomes our voice, so that what we imagine to be our singing imagination is directly translated into feeling for movement. And it's that sort of area I'm interested in today, because I feel from my experience and also from observation and literature is that the tendency exists for us to think of expression as something rather vague, in the sense that we might have a very definite acoustic idea of what is going to happen, but we don't really know where in our body we have to channel this. And then we see phenomena like people playing with great amount of movement in their bodies because they have a great amount of expression in their imagination, but this is directed into movement impulses that have nothing to do with sound production. And this is very common, and sometimes people say, oh, isn't she musical, she moves so much, but unfortunately when you just listen, this musicality is not evident. Just when you close your eyes, when you see it, you see lots of musicality, but unfortunately we are acoustic instrument, and we need to make sure that this musicality actually is directly and purposefully and efficiently channeled into the areas of our body where it really does matter. And often we have to observe carefully as teachers. We see this musicality in various ways in the student, but we must actually find it in the end here in the bow, and I'll talk a bit more why this is so important to talk about the right here when we talk about expression. Another consideration, if we already go and narrow the idea of tone down to the what actually happens on the string instrument, on a violin, of course we see immediately that bowing is the important aspect of tone production, but we must not forget that tone production is always bilateral. So you always have the phenomenon of the violin and the string working together, the string and the bow working together. So what we see really, we have to have a holistic conception often of tone, because the body functions as either a way to allow the transmission of forces to the bow or inhibit it. So if there's a lot of tension in the upper body, for example, the bow hand might not really function fluidly. The connection between the singing brain and the expressive voice or the expressive ear and the bow movement is not really extracted properly. It gets confused and distracted. So we need to always look holistically at a student and also at ourselves and see where are the blockages to the movement of the bow arm. We think of tone in very concrete ways. Lots of violin teachers here, so I don't have to tell you things you know already too well. We think of this phenomenon of friction, the friction between the string and the bow, and we think about the fact that we have contact points to think about. So I'll talk a bit about this later, but we of course have to, our tone production is vitally dependent on where the bow is in relation to the gap between the fingerboard and the bridge, and whether it is perpendicular to the string, at what speed it moves, at what length of string it moves. So we have a higher, a shorter string. We need to modify our contact points to reflect that length of string, etc. These are the physical determination of tone. So often when we talk about tone in lessons, etc., we talk about contact points. And it was actually Flesch who properly identified contact point as the central phenomenon for tone production. Not bow pressure, not bow amount principally, because they are derived from our attention to contact point. What's useful about that, I think, is that if we think about our way of playing, we find that the contact point becomes the connecting point between our left and right energy. So our left and right forces. We can think of violin playing in a slightly inverted way. We can think that the contact point is actually the stable point, whereas the body moves entirely around it and adopts to this need to have the stability of contact point. And with that image or that metaphor, we can actually start to organize our sound first and then organize the ways we produce it, etc., quite naturally around that. So with attention to the contact point, we find it easier to organize movement. With attention to movement, we don't often find it easy to organize contact point. So it is interesting when we tell a student, focus on your contact point, that certain movement patterns change. Focus on your contact point and let the forces combine. Usually get us a better sound result. If we focus on the physicality of tone production, we have just a bit of organization here. We have the equipment, of course. There's the violin and the string and the bow and the bow hand, the rosin or resin. How often have we looked at the student's violin after we have worked for half the lesson on tone production? What's going on? Take the student's violin and play it, and you suddenly realize there's no rosin on the bow. So, or the bridge is crooked, for example, which makes it very difficult to. You only find these things out when you actually play the student's instrument, and sometimes it's a good idea to do that, like really regularly, to try to find out. For example, if the strings are old, you can work on sound production sometimes forever, and you never really get satisfactory results. So. And of course, students don't always know that, because over time strings deteriorate. They practice the instrument in a regular way. They don't really notice the deterioration, but they work on sound production. You work on sound production. If we don't check that the equipment is in order, then of course we are, we're wasting a lot of time. So equipment is kind of fundamental, and we need to check it. I have already talked about contact point a bit. We know that contact point is dependent on a whole lot of parameters. Bow speed is one, bow pressure is another. Bow speed and bow pressure are bilateral phenomena, so while we can see this moving and pushing, in the end there has to always be a resisting force. All forces of tone production come in pairs, and we always are well advised to consider the interaction of those pairs, because we might find that the arm movement doesn't work because the left has tension. So we release the tension in the left, we find that the arm movement in the right works better. So we always look holistically initially to make sure the forces of the right can be effective, because they are met by a free force of resistance. So when the bow moves, of course, we also know the violin resists upwards. And interestingly, the violin is a fabulous construction, as you all know. We say the best transmission of the force to the string is obviously when the bow is perpendicular to the string. And that is only achieved if the violin is slightly angled, because by virtue of the bridge, the strings shoot downwards. So if we want the best transmission of forces, the violin has to be positioned slightly elevated. Right? If it's here, we get already drift of the bow, ever so slightly. There's another big advantage if that happens. If we elevate the violin slightly, the violin sits in the body, in the collarbone, very effectively, and the upper body, the skeleton structure of the upper body becomes the structure on which the violin resists the bow. So in other words, the support of the violin to the bow is minimal, comes at a minimal cost to the body. All we need to do is really balance this lever. The violin becomes a lever a little bit with the left hand and no more. So we don't actually have to position the violin on the shoulder in order to get that stability. If we lift the violin to appropriate height, in other words, strings parallel to the floor, not violin parallel to the floor, because if the violin is parallel to the floor, the strings are down. So this transmission of the forces of the bow into the string, bless you, is very, very important in my view, because it provides a whole lot of associated benefits for the movement of the upper body and particularly the arm. So that's the way bow speed and pressure might be organized, because that goes through the arms. Contact point is dependent on length of string, so a note this contact point here, similar sound, contact point moves away, so when we go from high to low positions we have to move contact point. It's also dependent on angle of hair on the string, which gives us this idea of the rotational inclination of the bow, so flat hair versus inclined hair. Of course, if you flatten the hair, the contact point moves to the bridge, ever so slightly. Yeah? So it's thickness of string, so we have, we move the contact point with thicker strings and thinner strings towards the bridge, etc. These are important physical considerations, which I said already, contact point as a focus of our attention can be useful, but these are also things that we as teachers and as artists must understand and use towards our expressive aims, and also to eliminate obviously blemishes of sound or problems in sound. So for example, I might talk about this, I might talk about the way contact point works a bit later. I just do talk about a bit of summary of the issues. We have a big part of the sound production is the interaction of body and mind, so we have our imagination of sound, and of course the translation of sound to the reality works through movement. We need to think about how we are free and flexible in our movement, and how we don't interfere, or how we eliminate interference through poor coordination. Coordination is particularly fundamental for us, and if our movements are not coordinated, our sound production can't be good. So we might save our time to work on sound production if we work on coordination first, and then think a bit about sound production. We need to think about how movement is conceived in that sense. I've talked about this before. Movement is largely metaphorical. We move, and that sounds weird. We move as if we move. So in other words, we imagine our movement to feel a certain way, and then we move with an aim. But in that sense, movement is not a mechanical process. If I move my arm, it's very different from moving this thing on a table, because this is a movement that happens to this object on the table, but when my arm moves, nothing happens to my arm. I move my arm. If you move my arm, then something happens to my arm, because my arm becomes an object. But if I move my arm, this movement is intentional. It's not an object moving in space. That only looks this way. So this is very important, because you can conceive movement in a number of ways. The same objective movement in space, and I've used this many times, if you drop your arm versus moving your arm, you have two different movements. Objectively they're the same, because they move in space the same, but they're differently conceived. And they can only be so because my intention allows me to do that. So my metaphorical imagination says, drop. My arm doesn't really drop. It's still attached to my body, but my arm falls as if it's dropping, and therefore it moves in a particular way. If I say arm move, my idea of movement is much more active, and therefore the arm behaves differently. So generally speaking, our body behaves according to our metaphorical intention, mostly. And if we don't, for example, if we are drunk or deluded or somehow otherwise incapacitated, we might have trouble with this proprioception, and therefore with the connection between our metaphorical intention and our movement. And interestingly, certain movement habits might preclude us to locate bits of our body in a way that is effectively allows it to move according to metaphorical intention. For example, a student that has a very strong habit of just gripping the ball no matter what, if you tell the student just to relax anything, the student might not be able to locate anything to relax at this point. If you take the ball away from the student and just say, relax your hand, the student is able to relax the hand. If the student uses the bow, in the ordinary circumstance of playing, the student might not be able to relax the hand. This is very interesting and makes it an enormous, exciting challenge for us as teachers, because it shows, first of all, we memorize, we habituate ourselves according to contexts. So whatever we do in one context is a habit that might not be the same if it's in another context. And that goes for all our movements. So we need to develop the student's capacity to break open some of these contexts and use the metaphorical imagination to translate their idea from one context into the other. So in other words, imagine that you're not holding a bowl. Imagine you're holding an egg or something. Suddenly the student has a different feeling. So this is what I mean. Movement is organized in this way, and as teachers we can be much more effective if we use this as the key for our movement and not the mechanical description. This is what this talk is going to be largely focused on. Teachers often, because they see the student, use too much mechanical description. Put things here in space, put the ball opposite this flower. The ball needs to be straight, so we give a geometrical description. These are all true, of course, but they are actual secondary phenomena. The real phenomenon is what happens in the student's inside, if you like. So what's important with movement, of course, we learn it through practice, through experience, through conception, so we have an idea of movement. And in some ways, the student finds the movement. We can't move for the student. We find movement. We discover it. Ah, this is what it feels like. Now I know. And the teacher verifies, yes, you're doing the right thing. Now, remember what that feels like, and go home and try to recreate that feeling, reimagine that feeling, and that'll give you the desired outcome. What's important, immediately important to our physicality on the violin in terms of tone production is, of course, the way the bow hand is set up. And I'll talk about this a bit more. Why is the bow hand so important as opposed to any other limb? Well, the bow hand transmits the forces from the arm, because essentially, of course, the arm movements are the important drivers of sound. This is something historically Karl Flesch and before him and Dr. named Friedrich Adolf Steinhausen, they discovered that, because in the 19th century there was a lot of confusion about what elements of our movement were actually responsible physically for playing the violin. And the Joachim school had a view that the hand and the wrist were the drivers of tone production, which created enormous issues pedagogically. According to Flesch, set back German violin playing by 30 years. He says Joachim is to blame because he put all his students into professorial positions, and they taught these ridiculous principles of the Joachim school. And Steinhausen was a doctor. He said, how come these people play in a completely different way than they say they do? They don't follow the principles that they articulate in their playing at all. What I see is that the arm leads the movement, that the arm movement makes the sound, not the hand or the wrist or anything like that. And Flesch picked that up and translated it in a very unfair, dismissive way to Steinhausen. He said, Steinhausen doesn't really know, he's a doctor. I'm a violinist. I know. He's right. A bit unfair, but anyway. This idea that actually the arm leads and the hand follows is as a principle of sound production. That goes back to Flesch. But having said that, of course, the fingers and the bow hand setup is very important, because the arm can only lead if the bow hand allows the arm to lead, if you like, if the transmission is effective, because the hand is in that sense a complex hinge on the bow. So let's talk a bit about bow hand and bow hand setup. Finger placement. Capet, I will talk a bit about Capet in a minute, talks about the antennae, the role of the fingers as feelers, as antennae on the bow. The fingers are meant to be variously active and passive. Of course, that depends sometimes on the string, depends on the tone, quality, etc. But the idea is that the fingers, even if they look still, have forces that transmit into the bow in different ways, at different times. So the bow hand has to feel alive at all times. The fingers of the bow hand each have a role to play at all times on the bow. And I want to unravel that a bit. What Capet says in his wonderful spiritual way about his exercises, which I'll show you a few of them in relation to the control of the bow hand, independence of the fingers of the bow hand, is that The control of the fingers, which will be preferable in our opinion to the simple control of the entire hand, exerting all its weight on the bow in a single direction and preventing the profoundly artistic sensitivity of touch from revealing itself for the good of the art. Our fingers must literally be antennae to allow us to penetrate the mysterious world where few beings occupy the periphery and which has beauty at its center. So I love this idea that, you know, the feeling of the bow hand opens you with the spiritual realms. Let us not forget that the left hand represents only the material and that the right hand holds the secret which can assemble them with the goal of constructing the temple of beauty. So there is this clear division. Capet, he's got a very good point. The left hand is the material, the right hand is expression, is the key to expression. Who was Capet? 1873 to 1928, he was a concertmaster of the famous Orchestre de Concert Lamoureux in Paris. He founded a quartet in 1904. Let's see if it works, this link. Listen to a bit of Capet. Not okay, Google, sorry. How can you skip this? It's a bit soft, isn't it? So sorry, I opened two of them. That's why we have So you can have a rummage around the internet a bit, YouTube. You can see a couple of Capet quartet recordings, very interesting historically. How do I get rid of this now? No. 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 I don't want this. Surely there must be a way. Yeah. And Joseph Gingold was somebody who heard Capet, as you can see from this quote, in 19, I couldn't read 1928, but yeah, no, it must have been. Yeah, that's right. My connection with Lucien Capet began in Brussels 28, and he was most impressed by it, and I think also some of his, some of his principles of his thought and teaching evolved from that. Capet was a teacher in Bordeaux, and some of his students, including Galamian, became quite well known. Galamian, of course, Galamian took most of his bowing principles from Capet. That we have to remember. He left the spiritual stuff behind and functionalized what Capet had to offer. And he never really, well, I'm not sure if he acknowledged it much. And through Galamian and Delay, it's even found still in publications of Simon Fisher, people like this. All the moderns took their stuff from Capet, but no one talks about Capet. I always think that's a bit unfair, because Capet has really rediscovered what we do, or re-articulate what we do in a much more artistic way, in a much more authentic way than even somebody I feel like Flesch, who's Flesch, despite all his qualities, who's always emphasized the idea of a kind of streamlined sort of playing. He would object to what I say, but the fact still is that Flesch is largely analytical. He looks at a phenomenon and sees how he can fix it and correct it, whereas Capet is fundamentally artistic. He looks at how do we translate intention, how do we achieve artistic outcomes, how do we get closer to beauty, what do we have to feel, and how does our feeling actually achieve that, and our interface or our communication between body and mind, how do they actually achieve that? His technique supérieure is inspired, Capet is inspired largely by two principles, and it's very simple. For Capet, one of the big challenges is ignorance, basically. And ignorance is this kind of self-imposed ignorance, a very philosophical view. He has this wonderful picture here where he says, we are completely walled in by an excessive, this is all from his Technique Supérieure de l'Archer, it's a book about Bowie. We are completely walled in by an excessive pride which blockades us with some extremely limited knowledge and prevents us from discovering the truths which are beyond ourselves. We will succeed in breaking down this frightful wall by developing the two aforementioned qualities, because it hides from us that which is most beautiful, and consequently all which could allow a human being to become. Our dignity will grow in proportion to our destruction of this pride. And the two aforementioned qualities are attention and reflection. And this is a very simple way of looking at our entire pedagogical project. We need to be attentive to what happens. We need to be attentive to what we intend to happen. And we need to reflect how this is related. We spend, as he said, too much time in our opinions, and that distracts us in some ways from this mere observation, from this realization of what actually is the case. And if we follow this principle of attention and reflection in a consequent, in a consistent way, and in a serious way, we can solve all violinistic issues, quite simply. We just have to remember to continue in our reflection and remember to continue to pay attention. That's, in a way, easier said than done, because with every theory, with every conception, we limit to a certain extent our understanding and our attention already. So specialization of thought and knowledge through theory limits attention. And that's our danger. That's where we have to keep open and challenge ourselves. And that's what Capet emphasizes at the basis of all his teaching and of all his conception of violin playing. We start the practical exploration with a discussion of the placement of the fingers on the bow and the role of the fingers. You remember that Capet advocated, and if we reflect on it, we have to agree with him, is that the fingers on the bow need to be alive to the contact with the string. And that means they all have continuously changing functions, but some of them are more defined in a particular direction than others. So the pivot nature of the bow hand in this placement of the fulcrum, he uses 1 as the finger for the thumb, but normally we have 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't talk about 5 fingers, but you understand. So the first and the fourth finger have very different functions, which slide, if you like, into each other. The fourth finger balances the bow, for example, at the heel, or it might balance the bow also in a horizontal way, in antagonism to the first finger. But at certain points, they swap responsibilities. So you think about the bow stroke at the tip. The first finger, of course, takes most of the load, whereas the fourth finger is not entirely irrelevant. Whereas at the heel, the fourth finger takes most of the load, and the nab, the pivoting system, turns towards it. So you have these antagonisms in the bow hand, which sort of define some of the fundamental roles, but it doesn't mean that one finger is always doing only one thing, if you know what I mean. It's a completely dynamic system. So the second finger, or in Capet's thing, it's the third, it forms this ring, the ring with the fulcrum of the pivoting system. And the third finger is wonderful. Capet calls it the spiritual guide of the domain of general sensitivity of the fingers on the stick. So it pulls the bow into the string. There's a mysterious communication among the fingers. This third finger provides this mysterious communication. And the role of the fourth finger is very important, and sensitivity must be in two directions, horizontal and vertical. I'll talk about this a bit more later. Flesch dismissed Capet, famous footnote if you're interested in that sort of stuff, contrary to Capet, who thinks of the middle finger together with the thumb as a closed ring. Unfortunately, history has proved Flesch wrong, because the bow hand that prevails at this point is the Capet bow hand. It's the, we call it Franco-Belgian one maybe, or something like this. It's the Galamian bow hand, effectively. So Flesch, unfortunately, lost this one. Galamian took over the principles of Capet, and if you read through his understanding of the pivoting motions or the pivoting sensitivities of the bow hand, you have these 5 pivoting directions. So you have the need of the bow hand to be able to raise the bow vertically, this way. Yeah. You have the need of the bow hand of a horizontal motion. This is interesting. The horizontal motion between horizontal pivot between fourth and first. Why do we need it? It's because when we have the tip, which looks like this, the bow hand is oriented towards the first finger, and the bow hand might even slide on the fulcrum of the second and thumb up a little bit. So the contact of the bow with the first finger is not necessarily always stable. We allow, especially with short arms, we allow the bow hand to slide this direction, and when we get to the heel, the bow hand slides back this way. So effectively, if we do something like this, it simulates this horizontal pivoting movement. Then there's a horizontal pivoting point of the bow string. What does it mean? Hang on. Horizontal stroke inversion. Sorry. So this was the horizontal turning, pivoting movement. The horizontal stroke is effectively what people call collet or finger stroke. So the fingers have to be able to move the bow in a horizontal direction. So both vertical this way and horizontal. When we talk about how Capet develops it, it becomes clearer. And there's a vertical turning, which is the seesaw kind of thing. Yeah, this is important for off-string strokes or ricochet strokes. Is when the fingers take the load in a vertical direction. And then there is what Galamian calls a lengthwise axis rotation, which is the inclination of the bow, changing the amount of bow hair on the string. And it's a very important exercise in Capet called rouler, which we'll look at in a minute. Capet conceives it slightly differently, a bit more simple. For him, there's first of all the vertical finger movement. He has a number of exercises for this in his book. And the vertical finger movement, for example, you have here string crossings with only the fingers. So with only the fingers. We can practice these kind of string crossing movements with just fingers. And also in détaché or in separated, and as you can see, interestingly with different dynamics, which means the force of the fingers has to be different. So there's an idea that the fingers need to exert vertical force into the string and variously balance the vertical force. So the finger strength in the vertical direction is required. Obviously this is important. Capet talks about the fact that this is important for lighter strokes, because there the bow has to be, you have to feel how much depth of sound we're actually going to achieve. and the vertical feeling of the fingers into the bow that sort of completes the arm weight, if you like, going into the string, or mediates the arm weight, becomes very important in determining the tone color. The second thing that we identify for Galamian as a lengthwise axis rotation is this bow inclination issue, and there are actually some tone exercises that are very useful, because if we roll the bow with forte sound, so we teach ourselves to be flexible in the bow hand while maintaining force in the string. So the fingers have to be quite active doing this. You have to really feel that the fingers and the thumb are movable. One of the biggest inhibitors of natural tone production is the upwards pressure of the thumb. In our students, we often see that the bow grip is so tight that the thumb pushes up into the hand, and that disables the bow hand completely in many ways. It's really tight. It disables the bow hand because the pivoting can't work effectively anymore. So to loosen the thumb is one of the first tasks of achieving good tone production. And of course, to have a sensitivity of the thumb and know what the thumb is actually up to is very important here. If we can't tell if the student can't tell what the thumb is up to, then the student can't do anything with the thumb. That goes as a general thing. If we can move something, we know what it's up to. So active movement of fingers and thumb signals to our brain. We say, hey, you're there, hello. And when we have this feeling, we can actually do something with it. So it's not necessarily that this exercise, for example, rolling, is an exercise that is useful because we move the bow a lot like that. It's an exercise that's useful because it sensitizes our hand to our access, metaphorical access. So it gives us connection under the circumstances of pulling a bow. So Capet says we must require of each finger of the right hand an infinitely more subtle control than the simple pressure of the entire hand. I read that out already. This kind of harmonization of this system of the fingers. Because the bow is the soul of the violin, its possibilities should become for all purposes unlimited. One of the second part of Capet's technique supérieure is something that determines most of our expressive tone production. Unfortunately, it's not often understood what his aim actually was with this, and he's heavily criticized for what he's done. Basically what he said is this: a bow has distributions. If we have certain lengths of notes in relation to each other, we must proportion the amount of bow to these notes. So initially what he does is he develops a system, what you call this kind of thing, a designated system. So A would be if whole bow, B2 would be upper half, B1 is the lower half, C is the upper quarter, third quarter, second, etc. So you have these letters that signal, first of all, aha, this is a quarter, and then it tells you which one. C4, upper quarter, C2, second quarter in the lower half. The criticism is here, first of all, the opportunity is here that Capet says bow action needs to be organized. We can't have just random bow action, just any old way, and hope for the best. So in that, of course, it needs to be organized and coordinated. Flesch says, however, no, I'm afraid that's wrong, because when we want more sound, we want more bow, and therefore we can't just go by rhythmic denomination of notes, and therefore demand that they get the same, or a minimum gets twice as much bow as a crotchet or something like that, because it depends on which importance of the phrase the note actually is. Capet works with these largely even distributions. You can see that here, for example. So he says D7 and 8, that's the upper, no, it would be the low, no, it's upper. So you go from D7 and 8, which is the upper quarter basically. D is 8, so you go the top part, then you go 8, 7, 6, 5, which goes to the middle, then D6 is back into the upper half, and then you go back B2 half ball. And these are exercises to locate the bow distribution, to know how much ball is needed. Yeah? Because bow distribution in the end is the crucial factor in phrasing. If we don't determine how much bow is intentionally used, then our playing is random. And if our playing is random, then our playing is not artistic. So you understand this principle, yeah? So you have this proportioning of bow. And I think Flesch criticizes him on that level as well, or not perhaps directly. He says, well, it's certainly not denied that a particular distribution of the bow during a homogeneous legato passage is important. One should not neglect that in nuanced forms of legato, bow distribution must be uneven. So if you want to give a crescendo, you are not going to use, say, if I play 4 notes on the down bow, I'm going to use more bow for the ones that have to have the crescendo. But the point, I think it is, if you think, what's the value of Capet's idea of division then? Well, first of all, it's what I call heuristic. You have to first of all learn that there are these parts of the bow, and you have to be able to conceive them in a kind of schematic way before you can conceive them in a free way. Yeah? So you actually understand that's where the bow is, that's where the middle is, that's where the lower quarter is, that's where the etc. is. And then you can, of course, free this up. And in addition, it is a very crude way of looking at it. And Capet says himself, what we explain here is very limited by comparison to its possible realization, which one obtains through the accurate work with the bow. So the experience with the bow itself, these studies lead into a world of such subtlety that the words resemble marionettes on broken strings when it comes to translating such a world in concrete words. So actually to describe what we do with the bow is ultimately not possible. We can just really use a kind of crude grid system, which then we have to explore. So Capet's idea is, and that's where he's often misunderstood, is not a recipe for playing. It is an entry into the study of the bow. It's a very, very elementary vocabulary of the bow, if you like. And as such, we should treat it. Because in the end, the way of playing is not to be determined by a recipe or by an instruction. It is something that we discover through our artistic intention. And that's very important, that we don't formulate a bow technique that is so limiting in theory to the student that the student has no freedom for artistic experience, which is sort of the modern way of doing things. We functionalize everything so that in the end the student just has to learn the functional patterns, if you like, and get some kind of expression, standardized expressions, like ketchup. Yeah? We buy ketchup. Everyone eats the same tomato sauce. No one makes their own tomato sauce anymore. Why not? What's wrong with making your own tomato sauce? No, we go because it's so easy. We buy ketchup. Tastes quite all right. So everyone uses ketchup. That's a bit like that. We have the solutions already. Mozart, bow distribution. Clear. We can schematize the bow distribution. 2/3 of the bow, a little up bow, and then a bit more. Again. So we have a nice phrase, but it has nothing to do with artistry at this point, although it's organized. Yeah. So we can, of course, stroke design, if you like. You can have a stroke design for every bar of a piece, and that's very useful. But in the end, that's not what we should use to play. We should understand that the bow is used in this way. And to understand it in Capet's way is actually much more useful, because it now gives us the challenge to have to determine the freedom outside this grid, yeah? Rather than learning all the solutions. So Capet's approach is what I call heuristic, which is, it has a theoretical value, but it's like all theory, it's superseded by practice and by artistic. So it's just a guessworking. It's something that allows us to guess, to be used in practice, when the practice is much, much more important and detailed than any theory could ever be. Because bowing and sound is based on feeling and our imagination ultimately, not on mechanical principles. And the movements that go with that have to be found. So we have to teach the student to feel the connection between the singing voice and the bow movement. Not say you're going to use 3/4 of the bow for this note, because then you're going to use only a, etc., etc. This way we never get a natural personal interpretation. Of course, the third point of bow and sound production is this very important point of parallelism, Capet calls it, contact point. So the need of the bow to be perpendicular to the string and parallel. He's got a number of exercises for this, again with the bow distribution determined here. For example, C is quarters, so he starts at the here, and then E is thirds of the bow. So these are very simple exercises to practice the parallelism of the bow in the various parts of the bow, and with various amounts of bow distribution. You can look up these exercises. And the fourth thing is, which is very important, and very difficult to understand in some ways, is what Capet calls the horizontal movement. The horizontal movement consists of increasing ad libitum the pressure of the bow on the string as the first and fourth finger press on the stick alternately in the direction of the string. So the first finger pulls the bow, the fourth finger pushes the bow into the string. So the fingers exert horizontal force into the bow and into the string. Galamian has this horizontal pivot, but this way, so this is a horizontal pivot, but Capet relates it to the actual bow action. She says it's the important for the great strength or great power of penetration of the bow. So in other words, the finger action is not just vertical, but the fingers draw the bow into the string, and interestingly the fourth through a push movement, whereas the first through a pull movement. And that is, of course, comes to the important point that the fourth finger has to be placed on the inside of the octagon of the plane and not on the top, because if it's on the inside, it can exert this push force. If it's on the top, it can't really exert that push force. It's a point that Galamian makes, and it's quite important because it gives the bow hand a completely different stability, if that is the case. Is it clear what I'm talking about? Yeah. The inside of the octagon, the fourth finger can push into the bow, and that exert this horizontal movement or horizontal power, which is very important for the dynamic nuance, because the release of this horizontal power and the various tightening of the fingers or force of the fingers in the string will make it possible to nuance the sound. So Capet has a number of exercises here where this is the case. This mostly happens in double stop, so you can when you string cross, you can increase the force, this horizontal force. You can feel this horizontal force of the bow, and he has a number of these exercises. So this is a further element of his importance of tone production. One of the issues that's always a question for our string players, because the bow is kind of limited and we have the discrete nature of the strings, is that our tone production is interrupted by changes, so bow changes and string crossings. Capet is quite clear. There's these interesting string crossing exercises that limited the angle of the string crossing will give us a much smoother legato. So you have this diagram here where you can see the bow angles. It's of course, if you go from, say this is the G string, if you go from the G string to the D string, conceivably the angle could be here. And then the D string angle would be here. So you can have a much larger angle, but this is suggesting that the angle of the G string to the D string could be minimized, which is what we should be doing in order to achieve legato. So we get this. We get the minimal angle for our legato playing. It's often neglected. So you have so you have here in terms of the tip. So I go like this. As you can see, the tip movement is much smaller in the second version because the angles are narrow, which results in a better legato. And you can have these interesting exercises. So you have different fingerings which give you different angles to practice your conception of legato playing. It's also quite clear that there are two different challenges very largely in music. You have, if you have a tempo adagio here, you need to determine the articulation differently. So a smooth string crossing or smooth, particularly a smooth bow change, may not be desirable in a faster tempo, where we want to accentuate and give life to the music. So legato is obviously important in lyrical music, but everything slurred together and soupy may not give our playing the life and valve and energy that is required. So there is an important element where we have to practice nuance détachées, accentuated playing. Yeah? So to wake up the listener, yeah, through our fiery détachés. So this is okay if you play, if it's kind of nice and smooth, etc. But not all détaché, and not fast playing may not have to be smooth. Later on, there's an interesting aesthetic idea that he proposes, which I really like. I'll try to talk about it a bit towards the end. Now, the next point, which is very important for tone production, of course, is the contact point, and you can see here the diagram that you have a thick string, low, etc. Your contact point has to vary. So you have a long string, a long open string, whereas here you have a very short string, so the contact point has to be much closer to the bridge. It doesn't really show in this diagram all that well, but the fact is that you have a note here on the string. Yeah, it's a massive difference of contact point. And in many contexts, we actually have to practice this because we might have oscillations. So we might have differences of contact point between two strings. So we have here, we have very close, almost same length of string, and now we open. So tense already, we have a significant difference of contact point. Now, why is this important to practice? Because it needs to be negotiated through the feeling of our bow hand. Yeah? We have to rebalance the bow ever so slightly to feel what actually the strings do. Yeah? There's no mechanical recipe for this. We have to start feeling what goes on, and our ears will be the judge. And Capet, interestingly, says we must do this with soft dynamics, because our feeling in soft dynamics is much, much more developed. So he has quite a lot of tone exercises that are soft when it comes to these oscillations, including this balance of the bows double stop, but including also something he calls sans filet, or that the French calls sans filet. What's interesting here, sans filet on double stops, which is what we just looked at, with loud left-hand vibrato, allows efficiently to call all our imperfections of sound. One will be able to regulate the penetration of the hair into the string while taking note of the different oscillations, changes of string levels, according to the intervals. It is well understood that in a forte dynamic, this meticulous practice will have only relative benefit, as all that will thus transpire is noise. But when it comes to performing a piano passage, it is then that we are able to see the many flaws in our instrumental aesthetic, which were hidden by our vibrato and by our effervescent dynamic. So if we play loud and with lots of vibrato, we don't develop as much feeling for our bow. If we play softly, we develop more feeling for nuance and balance. Interesting, because we are so driven towards big sound, yeah? But there's a good point that we should practice some of our tone exercises in soft dynamics to develop a more subtle feeling for the bow, especially in slow. So he has these very high and very slow, if you can see, this is D, this is an eighth of the bow. So there are 8 bars and very très long, very slow speeds and very soft dynamics. It's very hard when you almost only work with your feeling of your fingers on the string. There are some further tone exercises that also people like Flesch, or you can find them in Fischer, etc., that are extremely useful and have always been advocated. For example, portato, which is an inflection of the bow stick. So it's essentially a legato stroke with a belly. And this vertical force from the fingers, and to a certain extent also from the arm, this indentation of the bow, is useful to sensitize ourselves to the resistance of the string. Capet has a number of exercises in all various different parts of the bow, basically all just based on scales or some double stop scales, where he just asks us to work on all parts of the bow to be able to provide this inflection. Portatos, as I said, Flesch also advocates. Articulation, of course, very important point. And a seminal exercise here is the grasp of the string followed by quick release. It's an exercise we find in Dunes and we find in Galamian as well, I think. So the bow needs to articulate, grab the string at the point of leaving the string. So here for example, he asks us to be at the lower 8th. What it does, this is the important part. What happens here? Because this has to stabilize the bow on the string. So the bow control doesn't come from here, from the note. The bow control comes from what happens between the note. And he has a little sign here which says stabilize the bow on the string. Prepare the next grab, if you like. And you have even this very interesting exercise. This is a silent note, yeah? So it goes like this. Sorry. Which is very hard because you can see there's a lot of tension that you have to get rid of in the bow hand to be able to work with the bow above the string. This is a tone exercise by Isai. Yeah, just to move the bow above the string about a centimeter and try to remain absolutely parallel to the height above the string, which means the fingers have to be extremely subtle because, of course, with the length of the lever, the bow is starting to shake much more. So the fingers have to increase their sensitivity. These bow control exercises are important because in the end we need to be able to move the bow fast, potentially fast, across all, in its entire length. Massart, who was a student of Kreutzer in 1830s, published a collection of 412 exercises. We call them 412 ways to practice the Kreutzer studies. I can recommend this very much because it's a very interesting document. It shows us actually how Kreutzer was taught and appropriate in his own time, and probably by himself. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that the first exercise of many of those variations of the Kreutzer studies is this. It's a fast bow stroke. He says, move the bow rapidly from end to end. Our capacity to do that would require a great looseness and integration of forces to be able to do that effectively. You can try it with your students. It's not easy to do that properly and to do it without the bow flying all over the place. You're going to get this sort of thing. The bow hand has to be extremely loose and flexible to be able to do that effectively. And of course, we know in fast, vigorous playing, we need to use this bow speed, the bow at high speeds. So bow high and low speeds, extreme speeds of the bow are very useful to develop our coordination and our sound production in response. And we have this issue here, the contact point and bow speed exercises. This is taken from this Massart book from Goetz Richter too. So you can see uneven bowitude. not have the single note to be loud. We have the single note to be at the same dynamic as the slur. Yeah, it's very hard if we do it across the entire book properly. And these are important elements of sound production because we, in the end, don't want to be limited by where we have to be in the bow. We want to express what it is we hear. There's a further way in which we can approach contact point variation itself, because this sort of exercise relies on the fast bow to be at a different contact point, because the slow bow, obviously, let's take a simpler example. The down bow has 3 times a slower speed than the up bow, which means the contact point has to vary in order for the sound to stay homogeneous, if you like. So what we have to do, we have to be able to go in and out with the bow. So we need to learn this. We need to be able to move the bow in and out in the contact point. That's what I'm trying to indicate here. We need to have the capacity to move the contact point and maintain in some ways the sound. It's a bit like a relay exercise, but in this direction. That's a useful exercise to sensitize ourselves to the actual possibility to vary the contact point while the bow has still a parallel direction. And I think what I'd like to sort of finish with is this idea which I found in Bayeux. Bayeux, of course, was one of the sort of founder of the French school, beginning of the 19th century, wrote a wonderful book, The Art of Violin. And what always struck me about that, in Bayeux you don't find many mechanical descriptions of bowing technique. You always find reference to characterization and things like nuance. Nuance is really what we want from sound. We don't want a sound that's always the same and that is not related to any spiritual or artistic expression. We want a sound that speaks itself about something, and we want, therefore, a dynamic sound, something that obviously changes, not for its own sake, but changes in accordance with our vision and imagination of the phrase. So he also advocates this accustom the ear to soft sounds by making softness and lines the basis of one's playing and the paramount principle of one's performance. In this way, if the ears of the listener are also trained, the nuance captures the soul much better in return for this restraint. The performer then had that much more power to move the spirit. Interesting that we may have lost something about nuance with our incessant idea of the big tone. We actually lose a spectrum of the playing this way, and there's an advocacy to work on subtlety and nuance in our sound. And this subtlety, back to Capet, is actually something that will promote our dimensions of our art. I love this metaphor, which becomes almost a spiritual philosophy. In this instance, we are dealing with Detache and Legato, which she talks about, which in our view present 2 equally powerful, but in their expression 2 entirely different elements, like water and earth, fluid and solid elements. And thus can the combination of 2 entirely contrasting elements lead to marvelous reflections in our mind. In the same way as we can distinguish in our art water and earth, it also contains fire and air. And work has its mood, its atmosphere, its air, if you like, which combines with the deepest expression, which is its fire. The mutual penetration of these elements creates a vibrant and living work in the deepest depth of the sensuous world. I say sensuous because at this stage only means are considered which are perceived through sense perception. So we hear sound through sense perception. We feel there are means of sound that are sense perception. But now comes the important point. If this perception is deepened, it arrives at cognition, which allows the world of feeling to illuminate the sensuous world like sunlight in the stained glass of a church. So you get this interaction in Capet between the physical, the sensuous idea of feeling first of all, the sensuous idea of sound and sensuous idea of physical feeling, which then becomes much more important with the way we contemplate it further. So a bowing technique in that sense becomes no longer a technique, it becomes an art, because it becomes something spiritual, it becomes an expression of how we experience something, not just in the mere objective or feeling sense. So bowing technique and sound or tone production ceases to be something that you could ever do by recipe. It has to come in that form inside through the entirety, a combination of the spiritual imagination of somebody, or the musical artistic imagination, and the way of doing things. I think that's in many ways an incredible vision, which I feel is a bit lost sometimes in our pedagogy and in the modern writing as well, where we to sort of functionalize things. We love to identify recipes and how we do things, and that's not in itself wrong. It can be quite helpful, but it limits the student to this sort of discovery that Capet refers to. The idea that there's a sound, or there's a work on sound, a work on tone, and a work on expression, which actually allows us to express really what we imagine and feel, rather than what we are being told to produce. See, so from that point of view, I think it's an incredibly inspiring idea of identity, of combination between our sense and our imagination, our, in certain ways, also our reflection. Here's a bit of literature if you're interested. Of course, you know most of these things already. That's the stuff I've used talked a bit about today, the standard works. Any questions? I didn't talk anything about strokes, anything like this. But that's another topic probably almost. Any comments or questions? Asleep?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you use the bow to make a stronger projected sound?
Well, Capet has a view would be, and I tend to agree, is that you use effectively, first of all, the forces of the fingers, as well, of course, as the arm way. But the beginning of projection, or projection is an interesting topic actually, because projection, if I speak very softly but very clearly, my voice projects perfectly. So projection is not shouting. If I shout out there, you can't hear me anyway because I'm not articulating. Yeah? If I shout like this, you have problems because my articulation is not good. Not because I can speak plenty loud. So loudness, volume is not projection. Projection is clarity. Yeah? And so projection is helped by articulation, by density of sound, by clarity of sound. So if I play like this, it doesn't project because that does project because it's clear. And that form of projection can only come because I have a clear feeling for the contact of the string. So I like to think of projection away from this idea that we have this idea I have to fill the whole, like, you know, I have to play with loud sound, because that's terribly limiting. It's also not artistic. Loud has nothing to do with art. So projection, that's on a level of trying to organize the concept that contribute to projection. Now, violinistically, the first important thing about projection is that we understand that sound production is bilateral. So this is projection. This is contacted projection. I can do anything I like here. If it's not effectively combined with the left, it's not going to project. Why? The other thing is ineffective combination could be if I clap my violin, I reduce the sound because I have no force up it. Yeah? So projection comes because I understand the bilateral nature of sound. It comes because I understand the principles of projection, which is articulation, clarity, nuance. And also, projection comes because I understand the psyche of the audience. If I play at all with the same sound, could be loud and very nice. If it's always the same, it diminishes in projection, not because the sound diminishes in projection, but because the perception diminishes in attention. So you can find suddenly somebody's, why doesn't this person project? No, this person is so boring that I'm not going to listen to it. So therefore it seems like, oh, what do you say? kind of thing. Yes? So projection is a complex thing, and there's no objective, like there's no one bullet answer for it. We have to really understand how we convey our message, how we teach the student to convey their message. And in the end, I think it's about clarity. Good, very good question, I think. Any more?
Yes, a lot of the things that you're showing are, a lot of exercises about learning techniques and learning how to through all of this literature, is there much talk about, say, combining bow technique with, say, vibrato, and how those two things interact rather than just the bow technique by itself, is it?
Yeah. It's a good question again, and it's a tricky question because obviously there is an element of contribution to even projection that you get from vibrato. So the whole point about vibrato is that the oscillation of the sound makes it louder because it takes our attention more. So on that sort of psychological level, if somebody plays with a lot of vibrato, they seem to project more. And that's why the modern violinists love, this massive vibrato everywhere, because it excites our perception. So there's an element, not quite your question. The whole element, how I sort of combine expressive nuances, say vibrato with certain bow speeds, for example, fast vibrato with slow bow speed, or vice versa, etc. Yeah, there is a lot of that discussion in the sense of these are the means. Practice it this way, then you can use it. Like here's the honey mustard sauce, or do you want ketchup or chili sauce, etc. So along those discussions, this is the sources you can make, and then you decide what it fits to that. There's a lot of discussion that you can find. Simon Fisher talks about that, and so the combinations of those things in a functional way, yes, definitely discussed. What else is discussed is finger angles and sound. So some people discuss the flatter finger angle gives a more mellow sound, whereas a steeper finger angle gives more articulation and a more glassy sound. So there's a way in which that contact determines the characteristics of sound. What I wanted to stay away from today, I want to stay away from that a bit because I wanted to highlight what interests me at the moment is this idea that really there are two very different functions in the left and right, and that the thinking of the student and our thinking as musician has to be directed when we talk about expression, first of all to the bow, I think, and really work on this, the way the bow can produce, or the way the bow can express what we are actually wanting to hear. So things like vibrato obscure that often, and the student goes very quickly to the vibrato when they want to be more expressive. And if they neglect the bow, then there's not going to be much advance. Yeah. So if you can play a phrase expressively without vibrato, and ever more expressively without vibrato, then you have a real strong foundation for expressive playing. But of course, yeah, so absolutely, there's a lot of further nuances in terms of relationship between vibrato and bow, and also finger angles and sound that are very important.
And how the bow might respond to what you're doing, how you might use the bow to respond to
Yes. How it combines. That's correct. And when you are looking or when you are exploring what it is you want to hear and feel, that's where you are going to experiment to a certain extent with these possibilities. But then, of course, you have also further relationships, very important ones, between fingering and sound. So the nuance in terms of where on the string, or on which string you play something, with which finger sometimes even, but mostly, of course, in which tone color. That's very fundamental to sound, and that's very important to consider in a sort of artistic sense. It's just obviously conceptual that way. And Flesch dedicates a whole book to fingering, and 2,500 examples of fingering, which is really interesting and useful, but it's a whole different topic. Evidently, this topic is so fundamental that you could lead everything we do back to it. Yeah. So because in the end, tone, we are tone artists. Yeah. Klang, we are Tonkünstler, the Germans say. Artists of tone. That's what we are, as opposed to sculptors or painters. So tone is fundamental to us.